Hey, so my name is Ashley Elizabeth. I'm the administrative manager of the League of Canadian Poets. I'm really excited for this panel. I've been looking forward to it since the fall. I'm really excited to have Emily Riddle here with us as the moderator of this Freedom to Read Week event. Freedom to Read Week is happening all week and is supported by the BPC. If you'd like to learn more, you can go to freedomtoread.ca. Okay, and okay, and I'm just going to give the League's land acknowledgement and my own acknowledgement because I'm actually in Kingston. I'm not in Toronto. Okay. League of Canadian Poets would like to acknowledge that this organization is situated upon traditional territories. The territories include the Wendat Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations, and the Métis Nation. The treaty that was assigned for this particular set of lands is collectively referred to as the Toronto Purchase and applies to lands east of Brown's Line to Woodbine Avenue, north towards Newmarket. The League of Canadian Poets recognizes the enduring presence of Indigenous people on this land. The League also recognizes that art, poetry, and poetic practice related to the work of our organization takes place in traditional territories of many different nations. We encourage each attendee here today to learn more about the treaties and histories of Indigenous people tied to the lands where you live and work. And I personally would like to say or acknowledge the original caretakers of this land in Cataraqui or Kingston, the Algonquin, Anishinaabe, and allied nations, the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy, which includes the nearby Mohawks and many other First Nations people who cross these lands for sustenance, trade, and survival. I'm going to turn things over now to Emily, and she will introduce herself and the panel.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight for celebrating Indigenous languages with all our lovely panelists who will get to introduce themselves soon. My name is Emily Riddle and I am Nehio from the Alexander First Nation. So I'm joining you from Edmonton, or what we call Amisko-Watsewaskygan, or Beaver Mountain House. There's this misconception that it refers to the fort, but this is a name we had before because there was this massive beaver dam across the North Saskatchewan River that lots of elders still talk about. So that's the reference to the name. Beaver Hills House is this, I love imagining this huge beaver metropolis. And Edmonton is in Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I thought I would also introduce myself in the language since we're in a language panel as well. So, Ogima Pipi Guanaskoyo Nitasigasan, Kaputaga Otsenia, Magani Wigan Amosko Atsewaskyganik Megwat. So my name is the woman who calls down the Chief Thunderbird, and I'm from Alexander, but I live in Edmonton. So I'm going to turn it over to the panelists to introduce themselves in a way that makes them comfortable. It could include language or not, where they're from, who their relatives are, and then maybe a little bit about their relationship to their Indigenous language or languages, some opening thoughts. So I'm going to turn it over to Ashley first, who has a baby on her lap.
Hi, Ashley. My name is Ashley and I'm from Makharui, and this is my sick daughter, Nibi, who's a little stuck to mama. I am from Ikhalui Nunavut. I am an Inuk artist, writer, poet. I haven't learned how to translate that, but I'm working on it.
And let's turn it over to Matthew next.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, everyone, for having me. My name is Matthew James Wigel. I'm a Dene and Métis poet and artist here in Edmonton, which I learned recently in Boan is referred to as Quaynade, which apparently it just means the city, which I think is the super appropriate for my people from Port Resolution, Hay River, Great Slave Lake, in the Slave River area. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And Selena, last but not least.
Yeah, so Tansei Selena Nitsigasan. So hello everyone. My name is Selena. So I'm a mixed baby. So I grew up with my mom on the lands of the Cowichan people. It's really beautiful territory on the West Coast. And my mom's family is white, and we have ancestors traced back to early colonizer settlers of Saskatchewan, ironically. And then on my dad's side of the family, my Nukam is from Waterhen Lake First Nation, and my Numussum is from Flying Dust First Nation. I didn't grow up in those communities, and neither did my dad due to displacement and entering the foster care system. And so I am not members of those nations. I don't claim to be, they don't necessarily claim me, but that is where my ancestral ties are. And I just want to always make that really clear, sort of the experience that I'm speaking from, and that my language journey is definitely one of it's been up and down, certainly. There are times when I will choose to introduce myself in Nihiwewen, and there's times when I don't. And I think right now I'm just in sort of a reflective mood about when and how I use language. And also, I am a learner, so I stumble a lot with my pronunciation, and today I'm feeling a little shy. So that is how I'm going to introduce myself today.
Thank you. This is some good opening words. So one thing when I was reading or rereading all of your books was a theme of like water, or like a relationship to waters that are in our territories, or waters where we grew up, which I know, Selena, you grew up next to the ocean, which is terrifying piece of water. And I always, whenever I lived in Vancouver, I always like prayed about not eating me as a prairie person living on the West Coast. And I'm physically right now like close to the North Saskatchewan River, which is a river that's fed by the glaciers in the mountains. So that's something I reflected on in my book too, was what happens when these glaciers melt. But I wanted to ask about a bit about where you are in the bodies of water you're in relationship to, and how that shows up in your poetry in relating to language, if anyone wants to start with that.
I can start, since you were referencing sort of West Coast and yeah, so I did grow up with my mom, and so I grew up not on my traditional territories, and not with a relationship to those landscapes. And it's funny you're talking about how terrifying the ocean is, because yes, I agree, it is very terrifying. And I'm actually not a very strong swimmer. So water has been something that always kind of, I have a tenuous kind of relationship with. Like, I both really enjoy it kind of, but then it also kind of freaks me out. And I spent a lot of time, I think, in my book personally, thinking about, because both of the communities where my family is from are close to lakes, so Meadow Lake and Waterhen Lake, and Waterhen Lake is quite large. And I also spent a lot of time thinking about sort of displacement from those places of water, and especially, you know, even just the differences between like bodies of water that are lakes versus rivers versus ocean. And so I think what comes through in my book, or what I think I was trying to do in my poetry a little bit, was address some of that feeling of displacement, and also that messiness, and acknowledging that acknowledging that messiness, I think, and not always knowing totally what to do with that, I think, in the writing and the work. Yeah, that's what I'll say there. I'll start there and then pass it on.
Yeah, for me, my title of the book is Where the Sea Guniks the Land. And a gunik is like when you sniff someone, so you would. So I was sitting by the shoreline one day during the pandemic. It was quite hard not being able to connect with people. But that's where like I found the most comfort, is right by the sea. And I lived just 5 minutes away. So I was sitting, and then I saw the way the water was coming in, and I was like, oh, it sounds like, and it looks like it's just coming in for a quick little kunik, a nice little kiss. And then I started to think about the relationships that the land has with each other too, like the water and the land and the animals and the sea. And I think that was like where I found a lot of comfort, to be like, okay, these very powerful elements are able to live harmoniously with each other, and like, you know, we're on their land, we're in their waters, you know, that's always how Inuit like kind of treat the land and ocean. So it was, you know, reaffirming to be like, okay, yeah, there's many different ways these, you know, we can relate to water, and it relates to us too. Inuit are very, very passionate about the oceans. In Nunavut, every single community except for Baker Lake, which is still a body of water, is located by the ocean side. So for Inuit, like it's our way to get out in the world, to go explore. It's where possibilities are endless and also frightening, because it's very dangerous out there too. And you know, you have to have like I've learned so much just from having to live by the water, to be cautious, to be careful, and also to like appreciate that this thing, you know, if it's too cold, you could get hypothermia and stuff like that. So for me, it was a place where I found a lot of comfort, and like I just kind of took what I was experiencing too in my own life, like struggling with intergenerational trauma, and trying to reclaim language too. And I found a way to express those very real struggles with this like very calming, beautiful landscape, or this, you know, massive storms that bring in like, sorry, I'm getting at a loss for words too, because it's it's something that like I'm still learning, and I'm never going to stop learning what my relationship with water and the land will be, because it's always going to be evolving. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Thank you so much. I think that really makes me think a lot about not just like what we owe reciprocally to the place that we're from, and the waters that give so much to us, but how those connections are so shared between all of us. And I think for me, being so close to the North Saskatchewan is really important. Not only is it a river that, you know, my people have traveled for many generations, but it's such a potent connector, I think, as Emily kind of mentioned it, as a river that starts in the glaciers and the Rocky Mountains, but it does flow to the ocean, and it in that way really connects so many people. And it's a very long and wide river system, as it links up all around. And I think that sort of interconnectivity is something I think a lot about and write a lot about. My background's in biological sciences and marine science, so I think a lot about how, you know, this little bit of water here is connected to all of the other waters everywhere else. And I think that's something that's, like I said, it's very potent, it's a very powerful image, but it's not just an image, it's a like a lived reality that we have to honor and respect. And I think, you know, I just always wish I was closer to a body of water than I am. And I live just like, you know, 2 blocks from the North Saskatchewan. Like I can't really get much closer than I am, but it doesn't mean I wouldn't love to be right beside it all the time.
And I love like Matthew's book also talks about some of the lost waterways in Edmonton too, because in building the city, there were a lot of lakes and streams and waterways drained. So I think people talk about this area of Alberta as being kind of like lakeless, but that's strategically done so. And then we have people building like faux lakes in the suburbs that have big fences around them too. So and this is definitely connected to language too. Like I think so much about the way you're talking all about water and connection to land. Like all of our languages are end up all being about connection. And when we do things in English, ends up being like English is like a language that was created for commerce, so very different purpose than languages. And like for Cree people, we understand that like the language comes from the land too. So it kind of it mimics all those things as well. So I don't know if anyone had any other comments about other folks' thoughts about water and connection to language.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think that there's always names for everywhere, and in some cases multiple names, and they're always tied to stories, and those stories always take some time to tell, and sometimes it's a short story, and sometimes it's a very long story as to why a place is named what it is. And so I think having access to those stories when you are lost or you don't have when you're far from home, that can be very powerful. That can be very important. I know just like all the stories my dad would tell about the lake or the river, and it's always a different river, it's always a different lake, but they're always stories that stick with me. And they're inevitably they're about fishing, sustenance, or they're about growing up, or they're about relatives. And then I think that that's something that really is in danger of being lost when you lose access to those stories, or when you lose the ability to share those stories with one another.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things I wanted to talk about, because we're doing languages, is about kind of the joys and tribulations of translation. And I was actually, this is like a little aside, but I was reminded to tell this story today of I was sitting with some elders, and we were talking about land-based programming at the library, and teaching little kids like 6 to 8 about treaty. And so we were reminding the folks we were meeting with who are non-Indigenous teachers about like the X. I don't know if anyone's heard that about the syllabics, like the E sound for us. So folks, when they sign treaty, which is always a bit of a misnomer for us because we entered a relationship, signed with an X. And we're told a lot of the time that that's just because they were illiterate and didn't know how to sign in English. But it was because we were the E for us in syllabics means like the center of everything, or the ability to recreate the universe. So it was asking the whole universe to witness that treaty agreement. So I was reminded to tell that story today. So I will say that. That's what that X means, is like the whole universe witnessing that interaction. And so I wanted to talk about, the trials and kind of and tribulations of translation. So in Matthew's book, we get to sit with ruminations about treaty, which is a big exercise in translation. Like in Treaty 6, we hired our own translator for better or for worse for that negotiation. Ashley, you've chosen to include footnote translations in your book, as well as a glossary with how to pronounce. And then Selena, in your book, like sometimes you give us a clue into the definition of an Ahio word you're using, and sometimes not too. Like it seems strategic how you're choosing to do that. So I wonder if you could all share a little bit about those choices in your book for translation, or thinking about translation. And anyone can start.
You might hear my daughter crying in the background. She's cared for by her dad. So for me, it was easier to include a footnote with like words here and there. I didn't grow up speaking Inuktitut. I grew up in my home community of Iqaluit, but where I'm 3rd generation, like colonized or assimilated Inuk, as you would say, like my grandparents transitioned from the semi-nomadic lifestyle into the settlement. And with that, they lost a lot of language, having to learn English and, do things like pay bills, which their parents didn't do because they lived on the land. So my parents' generation, my mom is Inuk, my dad is white. But for my mom, she has this like hybridized, like slang Inuktitut, slang English. And then my dad too is French Canadian. So he's also got like poor English and good French, but we only grew up speaking English in our household, and but with these words that I knew in Inuktitut because they were said all around me, but I didn't know how to properly translate it into English, which I thought was beautiful for a long time, because I was like, Qivik is an emotion. And for the longest time, I didn't know how to describe it in English, but it's like when you're a sore loser, and to include the words would just felt natural, because like I would say, oh, I'm going to use my avik, use my ulu, my holik, and it's more natural for me to say that I'm going to use my oil lamp, or my an avik is like a board you use to scrape the fat off of skin, and yeah, so all these little bits that have survived through that, I like to include them in my poetry as much as possible. And my goal is to one day to write poetry in Inuktitut, it's very complicated. There's now more resources out there to learn and to speak. As hard as it is to say, I feel like my generation was the generation that almost let it die. Because we didn't have it in school system, and I mean there was second language Inuktitut, but they framed it as you can choose it, but if you choose Inuktitut, it won't really get you anywhere. If you choose French, that will provide you job opportunities and whatnot, and that is unfortunate that our generation almost listened to that. But we're also the generation that kind of is going out of our way to relearn it and to bring it back. And the language has actually gone up. So there's now more Inuktitut speakers than there was like 5 years ago. So, and it's continuously going up. So one day I'll have a book all in Inuktitut.
I love that, Ashley. I'm also sort of in the same, that is like a dream. It's something that I've talked about before, but I just have this dream. So my cookum didn't speak English. She only spoke Nehewewen. She only spoke the Cree language. And I have this dream of like being able to kind of like speak with her in our language through sort of like dream, or even through poetry. And when I first started writing this book, that was my initial sort of like dream goal, that I was like, I would love for by the end of this to have a kind of a dream or a letter to her. And that did not happen, obviously. Language learning is so messy and so hard. And something, Matthew, I think that you brought up as well, actually everybody has brought up, is that, that relationship between land and language. And especially when you're trying to learn a language and you're not necessarily on that land, it's really hard because it's so embedded. Like you can't really have the language without that land relationship, just as you were talking about sort of the use of particular things that you use in your community to prepare food, and that it's like active, it's used, right? And that I think the challenge, at least in my language journey, has been sometimes it's quite static, or we're sort of forced into classrooms to learn, and that isn't our language. Like it's not, it's, I don't know, language exists like on the land, in use, in community, between people. And something that I thought about a lot working on my book was that idea of translation. And something you're talking about was sort of what are we able to translate and what are we not able to translate. And I think for me, my poetry collection is called Undoing Hours. And a lot of that had to do with undoing sort of the English of my mind, and that sort of colonial mindset that, as you said, English is a language of commerce. It's a language of objectification, that we have this like distance from the land inherently embedded in our grammar structures that make it then possible to extract resources in a way that doesn't see the land as a being, as something that we're in relation to and that we have responsibility to. And so I think, Emily, as you pointed out, yeah, there definitely are moments where I sort of hint towards that, and moments, or like hint towards a definition or a translation, and moments where I don't. And full transparency also, I've used certain words in there wrong, because especially when I first started this journey, I was often just like going onto the internet and like Googling translate things on the Cree dictionary, and I didn't necessarily have those relationships where I could be checking or talking to folks. And so I wanted to keep that in, though. Like I wanted to keep those mistakes in, because I think that's an important conversation as well around sort of displacement and access to knowledge that is really important. And I feel like I have more to say, but I'm going to let Matthew step in for a moment if you feel so inclined, and then maybe my train of thought will return. It's kind of wandered out the window for a minute.
Sure, no worries. Yeah, I think the question of translation is super interesting because I think I studied logic and language systems a little bit in my undergrad. That's what my minor was in. And you're kind of taught, and there's a sort of prevailing idea that everything is translatable, and that this idea that there's almost this like mathematical thing, that it might take you more words to say something in another language, but eventually you'll get there. You'll get to the root of it or the meaning that's behind it. But I don't believe that. I don't think that's necessarily true. And I think that all of us can probably come up with an example of why we don't think that's true, or a counterexample of some sort. But I think that really speaks to that sort of Western commerce-based kind of mindset, where it's this transactional thing that you can exchange one idea for another, and you cannot lose anything in the translating. And I think even having that perspective, it allows so much to slip by, and it allows so much to be lost, but lost in a way where there's no attempt at recovery, or there's no attempt at understanding even. Because if you start out with the assumption that these are exchangeable one for one, then you're assuming that anything you miss doesn't exist. You've got everything. And so that simple act of erasure that kind of goes without even noticing is something that can be really devastating when you're talking about something that's so valuable and so important as relationship to each other, its relationship to the land and other nations. And I have to think about, treaty and this idea of translation that Emily mentioned. It's so fascinating to me because you have an attempt at navigating worldviews and navigating needs and perspectives. And as soon as you think that you can make a transaction without losing any understanding, and you're bound to lose so much. And that, that happened every single time, to larger or smaller degrees in different places. And even the simple thing of like Canada saying, here are the numbered treaties, 1 through 11, that kind of puts them all on this level playing field of they're all the same thing, but they're not. Every treaty is made with a different nation, with different nations, different people, and everyone has different perspectives on what is being translated and what's being mistranslated. So I think even if we just take the basic premise that you can't translate everything, or really anything, that I think that would go a long way to just admitting what it is we're losing and what we're gaining when we try to share perspectives with one another.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you all so much. Did you have anything to add to each other? Selena, did you have more that came to you?
I'm just listening so intently. I'm feeling so just happy to be in this conversation, honestly. All of you are giving me, my brain is still chewing a little bit, I think.
Mm-hmm. I love that idea of accepting that, translation can never really occur. Like thinking about, like I get reminded a lot that culture is like a process, not a product. And I think sometimes we think about, like one for one really being able to happen. Also, like, I guess I'm thinking about, I was in Toronto a few weeks ago, and then I went to the Royal Ontario Museum to see a bunch of Paul Kane paintings of Fort Edmonton. And there's all of these things, all these pipes and all of these gifts given to the Treaty Commissioner on display in really culturally inappropriate ways. And like for us, if you're given all these like huge gifts, you would pass them on intergenerationally in your family, you would think. But he immediately, like these folks immediately went to Toronto, left the prairies, and then offloaded all of their gifts to museum collections or to private collectors. So very odd, like just totally different ways of viewing the world in terms of gifting or language or things like that too. Yeah. Anyone have any other things to add before I go on to next question? I feel like a very chill moderator. I'm not gonna move us along unless we're ready to. I think so. I used to do work in BC for BC First Nations, and there was a lot of grief around language loss because BC is one of the most linguistically diverse places in the world, actually. And so I'd be working with communities trying to develop language immersion degrees where they only had maybe like 5 speakers left of their dialect and things like that, or Squamish only had 12 fluent speakers. They've actually upped it by quite a bit recently, but I was also thinking about other places in the world like New Zealand, where they have a lot of media and poetry and even like academic journal articles in Maori. And so I think it's really important for us to talk about, especially during Freedom to Read Week, about the violences like that continue to remove us from our languages and how difficult it is to structure one's life in a way that allows us to regain fluency. Like I have a 9-to-5 job, even though I get to work with fluent elders, I don't get to do language learning all day. And one of the lines that really got me in Ashley's book was, "I wish for the bitterness of assimilation to stop being so damn easy." That was like a very cutting line that stuck with me. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about, after me being a doom and gloom, what our hopes are for publishing in Indigenous languages in Canada, and if we see poetry playing a role in Indigenous language revitalization. Hopefully we do.
So the publisher that published my book, Inhabit Media, is based here in Iqaluit, and they make a really big effort to translate a lot of their content into Inuktitut. Inuktitut. So there's many different dialects of Inuktitut, but Inuktitut is kind of like the more generalized Inuktitut that is used with government and because around the town. So in Nunavut, every office, every building needs to have their name in Inuktitut, in syllabics, and translated too. And official documents too need to be translated in Inuktitut now. So for us, it's gotten a lot better to decolonize, or easier to decolonize in that sense, now that we've fought really hard to make our territory like Inuktitut friendly, and we're still fighting that fight too. There's the government's pushing back about language, and yeah. But for us, my hope is for at least for myself and my family, to become fluent so that I can just chat with my daughter about her day, or ask my aunt, great auntie, like, oh, how do I get down to like American islands, and be able to understand her when she tells me in Inuktitut, like, okay. So I think we're well on our way, but it does take a lot of work. And one thing that surprised me the most was unlearning this fear, this like, the lateral violence that I've experienced in my life for not speaking Inuktitut. Like I've had a lot of Inuit kind of like be disappointed that I don't speak, but express it in a way that was like hard for me to take. Like, oh, I thought you were Inuk. It's like, oh, I am. I just don't speak Inuktitut. So I think there is a lot of that in my community, like a lot of sadness that the language and the culture was like kind of dying. Like I mentioned, we were the generation that almost kind of put everything to rest to focus on Western world, and we're also the generation that was like, oh, that's stupid. But with that, there is a lot of like sadness from our elders, but like perpetuated in like laterally violent ways that I still get really scared to speak Inuktitut, and I'm afraid of making mistakes. And And I'm in an Inuktitut learning course now, which I'm very proud of, but I'm struggling every now and then to kind of like let go of that fear of like, okay, if I can't learn my language, I'm still Inuk, like I'm still Indigenous, you know, and I'm working towards it. It's that fear that makes it hard. It stunts growth. It makes it hard to be brave and say, I don't know how to say that. Can you please break it down for me? So that's what I'm kind of like dealing with these days. Like I said, it's never ending. It's more things are coming up as I'm learning and unlearning, you know, these colonizing, as I'm decolonizing. Yeah.
Yeah, I relate to that feeling of fear a lot in my language journey as well. It's a very vulnerable thing, and it's interesting, especially learning a new language a little bit later on in life. So though you may have heard the language or been around it, like to actively practice that speaking part, it feels very vulnerable. And it especially feels vulnerable. Even today, I said, I'm feeling a little shy. Like I didn't choose to introduce myself in the language. And that's actually just like showing that fear come alive, right? So like that's me. I was feeling a little fearful, and I don't, you know, have the correct pronunciation all the time, or I stumble on my words. And it's very scary and vulnerable to do that, especially when you're among like elders or speakers. And something that I've always reminded myself of when I am in language courses is often there's one experience where I said something wrong, and like in Cree, there's like a lot of words that can be construed kind of like dirty, or like there's like so I said something and it was like the wrong like context or like way to say it, and my teachers, they just lost it. They could not stop laughing for like, I don't know, it felt like forever to me. But it was also that reminder, and they were like, no, like it's not bad. It's just like really funny, and like brought there is joy also like in those mistakes, that there's like so much humor in our language, and that we can like play as well, and that learning that is important too. So that's something that I really try and like hold on to, I think, especially when I start to feel that fear, is remembering like there's a lot of joy and like there's humor, and you know, it can be silly and fun sometimes even to just like make a mistake, but it's like that context of trying, that's really important.
Yeah, so much agree with everything that's been said. And I'm thinking about something that Ashley said earlier that really stuck with me, which was this idea that teachers or educators saying, well, you should learn French because that's the language that will help you, you know, get a job. And, you know, it's like, why can't you just get paid to learn the language? Like, why can't we just, why can't we do that? Why can't we have that? And I think that obviously there's lots of answers to that question, or lots of answers that people would have to that question. But and I'm sure everyone here agrees that, like, you know, none of those would all just be excuses, and they wouldn't be like an actual response, other than that's just the way it should be. And I think that if we're gonna have, I love the optimism of like poetry having this thing that being this thing that can help us and can help language reclamation and language learning. And I love that, and I think it's so important. And I think there's a crucial step to getting there, and part of that is just the question of like scarcity and the day-to-day trials of living in the system that we live in. And it's so hard to just be here to do the things that we want to do, that taking that next step and bringing Indigenous language poetry to the level that we want it to be at, there's so much in the way. And I'm really optimistic, and I think that these statistics that are being shared about the increase in language speakers and fluent speakers is there's so much optimism in that. And I know like up north in Fort Resolution, you know, they've got a great school and they've got kids learning every single day. And it's a thing that, you know, when my dad was growing up didn't even wasn't a concept that he could have had. Wasn't a thing that could even be dreamt of. And so there's so much change happening so fast, and it's so beautiful that it's happening in a direction that we at least have the agency and the ability to continue that growth. And I love the idea that, you know, we in our generation, we can't even imagine how great it could be, how great it will be. And I think that's so poetic, and that's the poetry right there.
Thank you all so much. And we have, unless anyone has closing comments they'd like to make, I can open for Q&A or for questions for each other too, if you have any questions for each other. So if anyone would like to put a question in the chat.
Can I just respond to what Matthew?
Yeah, definitely.
Just about this idea that you're just my brain, you know, when you hear someone talk, both of you, all three of you are making my brain buzz in like the best way. And just thinking about that idea of, yeah, like why can't we create, I mean, we all know why. I mean, I'm saying that in the context of, we know the why, but it is wonderful to sort of imagine a world in which we have that time and that space to really dedicate to the work that I think we all really at our core want to be doing. And because we're in the system that we are in, we have 9 to 5s, or like I'm a classroom teacher by day. And it's also interesting making me think about obviously I'm in education, and so that is on my mind a lot, about the ways that we teach, the way sort of the structures that students have been kind of like introduced into the school system that we have, and how not conducive they are to learning, to actually true deep learning, and how frustrating that feels, especially as a teacher. Like I've just started, I'm really lucky where I teach, and I should say I'm on the beautiful territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh folks, but where I'm teaching, and there's little areas of land, and we've just been going and walking. And I had this really wonderful moment where I have some students who speak Mandarin, and they were interviewing trees. So they were having like a little chat with trees. And I found out, actually, I'm going on a meandering journey, but I'll come back, I promise. I found out that in Mandarin, similar to in Cree, that colors can be like verbs, or like are grammatically structured differently. And so they were making a joke about the tree, and there's sort of like overlapping meaning about trees being like that color green, and how trees can be green. And they did the interview in Mandarin, but it was just this really wonderful sort of coming together of different kind of cultures and perspectives that was awesome to see. And just makes me think about kind of the possibility of classroom spaces where we all have the privilege of sort of sharing that knowledge and seeing like, oh, okay, where do we have overlap, where do we not? And thinking deeply about sort of, you know, where we come from in relationship to the lands that we are based or are living at that time. This is all just to say that I'm agreeing with that. It does feel hopeful. Like I will say, being with students, I do feel that sense of hope, even though a lot of the time, you know, I do have like rage in my body and I feel angry and all these things. There are moments, even, you know, I'm teaching my students to do like teaching them what a self-location is and what that looks like. And those sort of like small movements towards understanding other worldviews, our worldviews, is so important. I feel like I just rambled, but anyway, mostly I just appreciate you folks. This is really lovely.
Thank you. No, I love the meandering too, as has been said in the chat. I think about that so much. Like Selena and I were in ceremony together in the summer, and I'd learned how to put up a teepee before, but we had our Muslim Jerry like do the actual like Cree way of teaching how to put up a teepee and taught us about all the moons of all the poles and that whole story from our creation story, and then how to like structurally put it up. And it's like the way that he taught it, it's still in my head. Like we really had our own means of teaching beforehand. And so like, yeah, like it stays with you more than whatever I've learned in the classroom as a kid a lot of the time too, because it involves your body as well. Like I don't know if it always makes sense to learn language like sitting in a classroom like with a board. I mean, sometimes you have to if you're going over like grammar sometimes to some extent and all those charts, but yeah, like our languages are also in our bodies too. We talked about land, but that kind of embodied learning as well.
Try to get people